Right now, if you crack open an egg for breakfast, there's an overwhelming chance it came from a chicken, not a duck, not a quail, not an ostrich, and certainly not any of the thousands of other bird species that lay perfectly edible eggs of their own. Chicken eggs have become so completely dominant in modern diets that most people never even stop to ask why. So, why exactly did the chicken egg win out so decisively over every other option available? Why aren't duck eggs or goose eggs sitting in cartons at every grocery store right alongside them? Let's dig into this properly, because the answer turns out to involve a surprisingly practical mix of biology, economics, and a few historical accidents that quietly shaped an enormous portion of the modern global food system. Let's start with the most basic biological fact worth establishing first, because it explains a lot of what follows and sets up everything else discussed throughout the rest of this topic. Virtually all birds lay eggs, and the vast majority of those eggs are, at least in principle, edible and nutritious for humans. Duck eggs, goose eggs, quail eggs, turkey eggs, and even the eggs of many wild bird species are all perfectly safe and nutritious to eat. And in fact, plenty of these alternatives are actively consumed as regional or specialty foods in various parts of the world today, which means chickens didn't win this particular competition because they're the only bird capable of producing a good egg. They won because of a specific combination of practical factors that made them unusually well suited to large scale, reliable, cost effective egg production compared to virtually any other available bird species. Let's talk about egg laying frequency first, because this represents one of the single most important practical factors in the entire story, arguably more decisive than any other single consideration discussed throughout this whole topic. Chickens, particularly certain breeds specifically developed and refined over centuries specifically for high egg production, are capable of laying an egg almost every single day, sometimes reaching close to one egg per day for extended stretches under appropriate conditions. This is an extraordinarily high rate of production compared to most other domesticated bird species. Ducks generally lay eggs at a somewhat lower average frequency, geese considerably less frequently still, and many other bird species lay eggs only during specific limited seasonal windows rather than on anything resembling a consistent, year-round basis. This single factor alone goes a long way toward explaining why chickens became the dominant choice for large-scale egg production. A farmer or food producer working with chickens can reliably expect a consistent, predictable, near daily supply of eggs from a properly maintained flock, which represents an enormous practical and economic advantage compared to working with a bird species that lays less frequently or only during limited seasonal windows throughout the year. In a competitive food production system where reliability and consistent output matter enormously, chickens simply outperform most other available bird species on this specific critical metric. Let's talk about breeding cycles and overall practicality next, because chickens also happen to be unusually well suited to selective breeding and rapid genetic improvement compared to a lot of other domesticated bird species, a factor that compounds significantly over successive generations of deliberate agricultural selection. Chickens have a relatively short generation time, reach reproductive maturity fairly quickly, and produce large enough clutches to make selective breeding programs practical and effective over relatively short time frames. This meant that once humans began deliberately selecting chickens specifically for traits like egg production, disease resistance, and general hardiness, meaningful genetic improvement could happen relatively quickly across successive generations, compounding over time into the specialized, extraordinarily high output egg laying breeds that dominate modern commercial egg production today. This connects to a broader pattern worth appreciating, because it echoes similar dynamics discussed in relation to how humans historically selected specific animal species for milk production as well. Just as cattle, goats, and sheep happened to satisfy a very particular combination of conditions that made them unusually well suited to sustained dairy farming, chickens happened to satisfy an analogous combination of conditions: rapid reproduction, high natural egg output, and a temperament reasonably compatible with confined large-scale farming that made them unusually well suited to sustained large-scale egg production in a way that most other available bird species simply couldn't match nearly as effectively. Let's talk about temperament and manageability specifically too, because this represents another significant practical factor in the whole story. One that becomes especially important once you're managing thousands of birds within a single commercial operation rather than a small backyard flock. Chickens are generally easier to manage in large, densely populated groups compared to many other domesticated bird species. Geese, for instance, can be considerably more aggressive and territorial, making large scale, densely packed farming considerably more complicated and potentially dangerous for the people managing them. Chickens, by contrast, generally tolerate close confinement and high population density reasonably well, at least well enough to make large scale commercial farming practical, which represents a significant practical advantage when you're trying to efficiently manage tens of thousands of birds within a relatively confined commercial farming operation. Let's talk about size and resource efficiency too, because chickens also happen to occupy something close to a practical sweet spot in terms of the resources required to raise them relative to the food output they provide. A balance that becomes increasingly important the larger and more commercially competitive a given farming operation becomes. Chickens are considerably smaller than geese or turkeys, meaning they require meaningfully less feed, water, and physical space per bird compared to larger poultry species, while still producing meaningfully more eggs per bird per year than most smaller bird species like quail, which lay noticeably smaller eggs despite requiring broadly comparable care and resources. This specific balance, reasonable size, reasonable resource requirements, and unusually high egg output relative to those requirements gave chickens a meaningful, practical, and economic edge over virtually every other realistic bird species alternative available for large-scale farming. Now let's talk about the historical timeline a bit more directly, because chickens weren't always quite as dominant as they are in the modern food system today, and understanding how that dominance actually developed adds an important layer of context to the whole story. Chickens were domesticated from wild jungle fowl native to parts of Southeast Asia, likely several thousand years ago, and gradually spread across the world through trade, migration, and cultural exchange over subsequent centuries. For a considerable stretch of this history, chickens were valued for a range of different purposes beyond just egg production specifically, including meat, and in various historical cultural contexts for purposes like cockfighting and ceremonial or religious significance as well. The specific, intense focus on maximizing egg production through deliberate selective breeding really intensified considerably during the more recent industrial era, particularly from the 19th and 20th centuries onward, as growing urban populations created increasing commercial demand for reliable, affordable, mass-produced food, eggs very much included. This period saw dramatically intensified, scientifically informed selective breeding programs specifically focused on maximizing chicken egg production, resulting in modern commercial egg-laying breeds capable of dramatically higher egg output compared to their historical ancestors, which weren't nearly as specialized or optimized purely for maximum egg production. This detail is worth appreciating because it means the chicken's current overwhelming dominance in the modern egg market reflects a much more recent, deliberate, and intensive process of scientific breeding and agricultural industrialization, specifically focused on maximizing egg output efficiency, layered on top of chickens' already existing practical advantages regarding temperament, size, and natural reproductive characteristics. Let's talk about the eggs themselves for a moment too, because chicken eggs also happen to occupy a fairly practical, middle ground in terms of size and nutritional composition compared to the available alternatives. Chicken eggs are large enough to be practical and satisfying as a standalone food item, without being so large that a single egg represents an impractically large single serving the way a goose egg or an ostrich egg often does. They're also small enough to cook relatively quickly and predictably compared to considerably larger eggs from bigger bird species, which can require meaningfully longer cooking times to properly and safely cook all the way through. This particular size, not too big, not too small, turns out to align remarkably well with typical human dietary portions and cooking convenience, which likely contributed further to chicken eggs becoming the practical default choice across a huge range of different culinary traditions and cooking methods. Let's talk about duck eggs specifically for a moment, since they represent probably the most commonly available alternative in a lot of regions, particularly across various parts of Asia. Duck eggs generally have a richer flavor and higher fat content compared to chicken eggs, along with a somewhat larger overall size. And they remain a widely popular, actively consumed food in various culinary traditions where duck farming has historically been more prevalent and practical. Given specific regional environmental conditions, availability of suitable water sources for raising ducks, and established local culinary traditions built specifically around duck eggs over a long historical period. This detail is worth appreciating because it demonstrates that chicken eggs' overall global dominance isn't absolute or universal. In specific regional contexts where alternative birds happened to be historically more practical, available, and culturally established, those alternatives have persisted as meaningful, actively consumed dietary staples in their own right, rather than being completely displaced by chicken eggs everywhere across the entire world. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about quail eggs too, because they represent an interesting different case worth mentioning specifically. Quail lay meaningfully smaller eggs compared to chickens, and while quail do reproduce and lay eggs at a reasonably high frequency for their size, the sheer smallness of each individual egg means considerably more birds, more housing, and more overall management effort are required to produce an equivalent total volume of egg product compared to raising chickens instead. This makes quail eggs less practically efficient for large-scale commercial production specifically focused on maximizing total egg output, which is a big part of why they've generally remained more of a specialty or regional food item in most parts of the world, rather than achieving anything close to the same mainstream commercial dominance chicken eggs have achieved. Let's talk briefly about ostrich eggs too, since they represent a fascinating extreme case worth mentioning on the opposite end of the size spectrum entirely. A single ostrich egg is absolutely massive compared to a chicken egg, roughly equivalent in volume to somewhere around 24 individual chicken eggs combined. While this might initially seem like it should represent a significant practical advantage in terms of total food output per egg, ostriches actually lay eggs considerably less frequently than chickens, and the sheer size and structural strength of an ostrich egg makes it considerably more difficult and time-consuming to properly cook and prepare compared to a standard chicken egg, which further limits its practical, everyday culinary usefulness compared to the far more convenient, quickly cooked chicken egg most people are already familiar with. Let's talk about nutritional composition for a moment too, because it's worth addressing directly whether chicken eggs actually offer any meaningful nutritional advantage over alternatives, or whether the dominance really is purely a matter of practical farming logistics rather than any genuine nutritional superiority. The honest answer is that most bird eggs, across a wide range of different species, offer broadly similar core nutritional profiles. A good source of protein, healthy fats, and various vitamins and minerals, with some variation in specific nutrient concentrations and fat content between species. Duck eggs, for instance, generally contain somewhat more fat and slightly more protein per egg compared to chicken eggs. While quail eggs, despite their small size, offer a comparably rich nutritional profile relative to their size. This means chicken eggs didn't become dominant because they're nutritionally superior to every alternative. Nutritionally, several alternative bird eggs are perfectly comparable, and in some specific respects, arguably even richer. The dominance really does come down overwhelmingly to the practical farming and production advantages already discussed, rather than any decisive nutritional edge that would have made chickens the obvious choice on health grounds alone. Let's talk a bit more about modern commercial egg-laying breeds specifically, because the sheer degree of specialization achieved through modern selective breeding is honestly worth appreciating in more detail. Breeds like the white leghorn, one of the most common commercial egg-laying breeds used in large-scale modern egg production, have been selectively bred so intensively and specifically for maximum egg output that they bear only a fairly distant resemblance, in terms of practical function, to the more general-purpose chicken breeds common throughout most of earlier agricultural history. These specialized modern breeds can reliably produce well over 300 eggs per year under proper commercial farming conditions, a seriously remarkable figure compared to the considerably lower, more seasonally variable output typical of less intensively bred chicken populations from earlier historical periods, or compared to most wild and semi-wild bird species generally. This level of specialization reflects decades of increasingly sophisticated, scientifically informed breeding programs, incorporating detailed genetic selection, careful tracking of individual bird performance across successive generations, and increasingly precise control over feeding, housing, and environmental conditions specifically optimized to maximize egg production efficiency. It's a truly striking example of how thoroughly modern agricultural science has reshaped a domesticated species. Chickens today, at least the specific breeds used in large-scale commercial egg production, function almost like a highly specialized biological technology, purpose-built and continuously refined over generations specifically to maximize one particular practical output. Let's talk about the economics of scale a bit more directly too, because this represents another important piece of why chickens specifically became so thoroughly entrenched as the dominant commercial choice, beyond the underlying biological factors already discussed. Once chicken egg production became sufficiently specialized and efficient through the combination of breeding advances and increasingly industrialized farming infrastructure specifically built around chickens, an enormous, self-reinforcing economic advantage developed. Massive existing infrastructure, specialized feed formulations, purpose-built housing systems, established supply chains, and distribution networks all became increasingly optimized and scaled specifically around chicken egg production. This created a substantial practical and economic barrier for any competing bird species attempting to establish comparable market share, since a producer wanting to shift toward large-scale duck or quail egg production would need to build out an entirely separate, less mature production and distribution infrastructure from a considerably weaker starting position, compared to simply working within the massive, deeply established, highly efficient chicken egg production system already in place. This kind of self-reinforcing economic momentum, once a particular option achieves sufficient scale and infrastructure investment, it becomes increasingly difficult and economically risky for competing alternatives to meaningfully challenge that dominant position, shows up constantly across a wide range of different industries and technologies, well beyond just egg production specifically. It's a useful pattern to recognize because it explains a lot about why certain products or technologies end up occupying such an overwhelmingly dominant market position. Not necessarily because they're dramatically, objectively superior to every possible alternative in some absolute sense, but because early practical advantages compound over time into deeply entrenched infrastructure and economic momentum that becomes increasingly difficult for alternatives to meaningfully challenge or displace. Let's talk about regional and cultural exceptions to chicken egg dominance a bit more broadly too, because it's worth appreciating that this pattern of overwhelming chicken egg dominance, while seriously widespread globally, isn't universal or absolute across every single culinary tradition and region. Various regional cuisines around the world maintain strong, actively sustained traditions built around alternative eggs. Salted duck eggs remain a significant culinary staple across various East and Southeast Asian culinary traditions. Quail eggs remain a popular garnish and specialty ingredient in various cuisines. And in certain specific regional and cultural contexts, other alternative bird eggs maintain meaningful, actively sustained culinary relevance and cultural significance that hasn't been fully displaced by chicken egg dominance, even as chicken eggs remain the overwhelming default choice in most mainstream commercial food systems globally. This detail is worth appreciating because it reinforces an important broader point already touched on throughout this whole topic. Chicken egg dominance reflects a specific, compounding combination of practical, economic, and historical factors, rather than some kind of absolute, universal culinary necessity applying identically and completely everywhere. In regions and cultural contexts where alternative birds happened to already be well established, practically suited to local conditions, or culturally significant for reasons extending well beyond pure egg production efficiency, those alternative culinary traditions have persisted meaningfully, existing alongside rather than being completely erased by chicken eggs' broader, overwhelming global market dominance. Let's talk briefly about turkey eggs too, since they offer another useful comparative data point worth mentioning. Turkeys lay considerably larger eggs than chickens, with a notably richer flavor that some people find distinctly preferable. But turkey hens lay at a meaningfully lower frequency than chickens and generally require more feed and space per bird, making large scale turkey egg production considerably less commercially efficient compared to chicken egg production, despite turkeys already being widely farmed commercially for meat. This is worth noting specifically because it demonstrates that even a bird species already extensively domesticated and commercially farmed for one purpose, meat in turkey's case, doesn't automatically translate into commercial success as an egg producer, since the specific biological and economic factors driving efficient egg production don't necessarily align with the different set of factors that make a bird species commercially practical for meat production instead. Let's talk about egg color for a moment too, since this represents a commonly misunderstood detail worth briefly clarifying while we're on the topic. Brown eggs versus white eggs reflect nothing more than the specific breed of chicken laying them, with no meaningful nutritional difference between the two, despite a persistent popular assumption in some markets that brown eggs are somehow healthier or more natural. This misconception itself is worth mentioning because it illustrates how much consumer perception around eggs has been shaped by marketing and appearance rather than any underlying biological or nutritional reality, echoing the broader theme running throughout this whole topic that a lot of what feels like an obvious, meaningful distinction in food often turns out to be considerably more arbitrary than it initially appears. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full answer to why chicken eggs became so overwhelmingly dominant turns out to involve a remarkably compelling combination of biological, practical, and historical factors working together rather than any single, isolated explanation on its own. Chickens lay eggs at an unusually high, consistent frequency compared to most other domesticated bird species. They reproduce quickly enough to make intensive selective breeding programs practical and effective. They tolerate the kind of dense, confined group living required for efficient, large-scale commercial farming considerably better than many alternative species. They occupy a truly practical middle ground in terms of overall size, resource requirements, and manageability. And their eggs happen to land in a particularly convenient size range for everyday human cooking and consumption. Not too large, not too small, cooking quickly and predictably compared to many of the available alternatives. Layered on top of all of these underlying practical advantages, several centuries of deliberate, increasingly scientific selective breeding, intensifying dramatically during the more recent industrial era, further optimized chickens specifically for maximum egg production, compounding their already existing natural advantages into the extraordinarily dominant commercial position chicken eggs occupy in most modern global food systems today. So the next time you crack open a chicken egg without a second thought, it's worth remembering that this particular bird species didn't become the dominant global source of eggs through some kind of inevitable, obvious biological superiority over every other bird species out there. It won out through a specific compounding combination of practical biological traits and centuries of deliberate human breeding effort, a combination that happened to align unusually well with the practical demands of large-scale food production, in a way that other perfectly edible, nutritious bird eggs, duck, goose, quail, ostrich, and countless others simply couldn't match nearly as efficiently or consistently, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as seemingly obvious and universal as eggs come from chickens actually reflects a fairly specific set of practical, biological, and historical advantages rather than any kind of inevitable, natural default, what other completely unquestioned assumptions about which specific plant or animal ended up as the standard version of a given food might be resting on a similarly specific, comparatively arbitrary set of historical and practical circumstances that just happened to work out that particular way?